the model of the Gospels that I have supported in all of my work on the Gospels is what I've dubbed the Reportage model. Very briefly, this is just the notion that the Gospel authors are trying to get it right and that they're very successful in getting it right. Now, the Reportage model has been used for a long time as a default by conservative commentators and, of course, pastors and laymen and scholars as well. The notorious skeptic Bart Ehrman will say that you should not use this type of model, for example, to harmonize. If you have an apparent discrepancy and you put the two accounts together, Ehrman will say you shouldn't do that. He'll call that making up your own gospel. That's what Ehrman will say. Now, what we usually recognize is that that's just a bullying tactic on the part of Bart Ehrman to try to stop us from using what is in fact a perfectly reasonable historical procedure to try to get information from multiple accounts. And we shouldn't use Ehrman as our model there. But unfortunately, sometimes it seems like the literary device theorists are following that model in thinking, well, we can't, quote unquote, write our own gospel and put these accounts together. We've seen already in past videos that the compositional device view of the Gospels with the fact-changing compositional devices and the Reportage model are very different. We talked about the probability theory of that a bit in the previous video. Here I want to talk about how they deal differently with specific gospel differences. Some of these we've seen already, we've talked about already, but I'll just bring them in briefly. So, for example, in Luke and in John, we learn of Jesus' first appearance to his disciples as a group after his resurrection occurring in Jerusalem on the very first night, very first evening after he rose from the dead. And then John describes yet another one about a week later, also in Jerusalem. In Matthew, the very first meeting that's described is in Galilee, and it in fact appears to have quite a number of differences. Matthew doesn't say this was the first one, it's just the only one that he happens to describe. Now, we recognize that these could both be true. They met Jesus in Jerusalem, and then sometime later they went to Galilee and they met him there under different circumstances, in fact, by appointment. Dr. D.A. Carson, a pretty well-known evangelical scholar, calls it tendentious to think that these are in conflict in any way. So he uses this Reportage model and says that, no, there's no conflict here. But in contrast, Dr. Michael Licona has argued that, in fact, Luke moved it. And he says that the first appearance here is the same in Matthew and in Luke, but that Luke moved it geographically, which would, of course, create a lot of other changes as well between them, with one being by appointment, one being unexpected, one being outdoors, one being indoors, and so forth. Now, similarly, as we've discussed in earlier videos, there are some differences concerning where Jesus met the women. So in Matthew, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, come to the tomb, and then Matthew carries on and he says the women and they and so forth, and they see the angel, and then they are running away with joy, and they meet Jesus. And he doesn't say that Mary Magdalene ever left the group. You might think she was still there. But when you read the Gospel of John, you learn that when she saw the stone rolled away, she ran immediately to get Simon Peter and the beloved disciple. And so then that explains how it came about that the other women came and they saw the angel and they saw Jesus. And then Mary Magdalene came back and she saw Jesus separately, and she was still grieving at first. So we can actually put these together with a little bit of historical imagination. And that's, again, something that evangelical commentators have long talked about and discussed various possible harmonizations here, because they accept as a default this Reportage model that they're probably both right, but we just are not always sure how to fit them together. In contrast, when it comes to these differences about the women, Dr. Licona says that he is more persuaded that one or more of the evangelists have creatively reconstructed the events of that watershed Sunday morning and the weeks that followed. And concerning Mary Magdalene, he says this: it appears that either Matthew or John has relocated the appearance to Mary Magdalene. This shows the extent to which at least one of the evangelists or the sources from which he drew felt free to craft the story. Well, it certainly shows the extent to which the theorist feels free to say that the evangelist felt free to craft the story. And this, again, illustrates the difference between the two approaches and the sort of anti-harmonistic tendency of the literary device theorists. That doesn't mean that they never harmonize, but it means they are inclined against it. Here's another example of the same kind that we haven't discussed before in this series. In the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark, they describe a woman who anointed Jesus shortly before his crucifixion in Passion Week. And the Gospel of John says that this was Mary of Bethany. In Matthew and Mark, it mentions that she anointed his head. In John, it mentions that she anointed his feet. Now, are these in tension? Is there a problem here? No, not really. In fact, again quoting Dr. Carson, he refers to a small dose of historical imagination. I like that phrase, a small dose of historical imagination. It wasn't like there was just a screw top on the bottle of perfume where you could just unscrew it and pour out a little bit and then put it back. Once it was broken open, you wanted to use all of it. And so she pours it out probably first on his feet as they're extended toward her as they're reclining, and then she pours out the rest on his head. In fact, John emphasizes that the house was filled with the odor, so there was a lot of this perfume. And that's entirely reasonable. That's how the reportage model works. We look at how these could fit together. In a recent interview that he's put on his YouTube channel between Dr. Licona and Dr. Craig Keener, Dr. Licona appears quite dismissive of this harmonization. He suggests instead that there was some confusion with the details of a different incident, and I certainly agree there was a different incident reported in Luke where a different woman anointed Jesus earlier in his ministry, and Luke says she anointed his feet. So Dr. Licona's idea is that these details have become confused, and that's why John says his feet. But I wanted to focus on the fact that he says instead of harmonizing, he says that she anointed both his head and his feet. And one gets the impression that he considers this to be very unsophisticated, sort of unsophisticated approach. He doesn't explicitly say that, but that's the idea, is that harmonization is sort of a little bit desperate or something of that kind, but that's not at all true. It's actually a very reasonable historical approach. Now, one way that we can use our common sense in approaching gospel differences is in the area of chronology or time ordering. In The Mirror or the Mask, and in all of my work for the past several years, I've made a distinction between two different ways of approaching time, and the difference here resides in the intention of the author or speaker. One of these is what I call achronological narration, and many commentators would call this topical narration, or they'll use some phrase of that kind. In this type of narration, you're not trying to say what order things happened in. So suppose you said, I had a very productive day yesterday, I fixed a faucet, and I completed a really important project at work, and then I went to the store and I stocked up on a lot of stuff that we needed in the house. Let's just say you're not trying to tell people what order you did them in. You're not saying that first you fixed the faucet, then you completed the project at work, and then you did the store, and maybe you did it in a different order, and that's just the order that happens to occur to you. And notice you just connected them with and, okay? And that's what I call achronological narration. Dyschronological narration would be if you were trying to give the impression that you did it in that order, even though you knew you didn't do it in that order. So dyschronological narration is where the author's trying to change things for some reason known to himself. Now, in this way, we can see in the Gospels that they actually pretty often, just like we do, narrate achronologically. Consider the temptations in the wilderness. Luke narrates them in one order, and Matthew narrates them in another order. But evangelical scholar Craig Blomberg has pointed out that Luke just uses connective words that mean and or but. And so he conjectures that Luke is not trying to give a chronological order in which they occurred. There's also an entire central section in Luke where he just says, as the crowds were increasing, or as they were going along, or some phrase like they came to a certain village. And it may even be that Luke himself did not know what order these things happened in. He just had this material he wanted to put in his gospel. This kind of achronological narration can also occur with regard to the amount of time that something took. So you might leave out details. You might just, quote unquote, hit the bullet points and not be trying to make it look like something took place over a shorter period of time than it really did. But dyschronological narration would be if you were trying to put everything on one day when you knew it took more than one day. Now, I think that we do have this kind of achronological narration in compressing, but without intending to give a shorter time than was in reality. At the end of Luke, the very end of Luke 24, he suddenly seems to get really rushed. And as scholar John Wenham, the late New Testament scholar John Wenham, has pointed out at verse 44, and again at verse 50, he uses this Greek particle de, and Wenham says, I wish they wouldn't even translate it. It doesn't even need to be translated. But it says the and, or some translations have then, but that can be confusing, or but. He opened the scriptures to them, told them the things concerning himself. This is not on the road to Emmaus. This is with the disciples, but it doesn't have to mean that he did it right then. And then at verse 50, it says he led them out to Bethany, and he was parted from them, which seems to be an allusion to the ascension. Now, if you just read Luke 24 all by itself, you had nothing else, you might get the idea that he's saying that the ascension actually took place on the same day that Jesus rose from the dead. And there are little hints even there, because if you kind of count up the hours and it's already evening and so forth, and when would sundown happen? He's not ascending in the dark. Okay, they couldn't even have seen him go up. So there are even hints right then that Luke realizes that it didn't take place all at that time. We don't know why he became so rushed. Maybe he was running out of scroll. Luke's gospel is about the length of a scroll. Maybe he wanted to catch a boat to send his document, catch the mail to send it to Theophilus. We don't really know. But when we look at other documents, including Luke's own other document of Acts, sent to the same recipient, Theophilus, he says that Jesus was with his disciples for 40 days. That enables us to go back and to say that he was not actually trying to imply that it all took place on Easter Sunday. But in contrast, Dr. Licona and also Dr. William Lane Craig have insisted that no, Luke really is narrating, he's compressing, but in this stronger sense of compression, that he's trying to put this all on Easter Sunday. But there's not really a need for that hypothesis. Now, one could imply a chronology. I'm not saying that chronology cannot be implied, but we can correct our ideas, and we should be flexible enough to correct our ideas about what an author is implying by looking at other documents, especially if they're written by the same author. There can be reasonable differences of opinion about when an author is implying and when he is not implying a chronology, a time ordering, or an amount of time, but we want to have these tools of achronological narration in our toolbox and reach for them freely as needed in order to give common sense explanations of differences between accounts, because we know that this really is something that people do. Right from the beginning, I've emphasized that the reportage model has no problem with faithful, recognizable paraphrase. Now, I want to give a sort of an ordinary world example of this. I have one daughter who is distinctly more practical than my other two daughters. Let's suppose, for an example, that I'm standing in a room with some friends and with that daughter, and that I turn to her and I say, "You are my most practical child," in front of them, and clearly for their benefit. And let's suppose that one of the onlookers is later telling someone about this slightly amusing incident and says, and Lydia turned to her and she said, "This is my most practical child." So there's this one little change, "you are" to "this is." That's exactly the kind of thing we get in ordinary paraphrase and in ordinary life. As I've emphasized in earlier videos, faithful memory is still naturally paraphrastic. We naturally paraphrase. Now we have exactly this type of trivial verbal difference between a couple of accounts of Jesus' baptism. In the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus comes up out of the water, the voice speaks from heaven, and Mark calls it a voice from the heavens and says, "You are my beloved son." In Matthew, when he tells about the voice from heaven, the voice speaks and says, "This is my beloved son." Very trivial verbal difference. Now, just to begin with, I think we can say that Mark is not trying to give the impression that only Jesus could hear the voice. There's not something heavy about this. He says it's from the heavens. And so it's clearly intended to be for additional people, not just a private revelation in Jesus' heart. And also, another interesting point, Matthew does definitely appear to have independent evidence concerning this event. How do we know this? Well, because when Jesus comes to be baptized, John the Baptist argues with him in the Gospel of Matthew, and that's only found in the Gospel of Matthew. It's not found in any others. Now, unless one's just going to say, oh, Matthew made that whole thing up, it looks like he had an independent source telling him about this. So it could extremely naturally have happened that this person who told Matthew about it, Matthew probably hadn't been called as a disciple yet then. His calling occurs later a little bit in Jesus' ministry, but that this person, like the witness of my imaginary conversation said, and this voice came from heaven and said, "This is my beloved son." Now, this would not be a problem, and this wouldn't even have to be deliberate. We've discussed earlier how someone might make a deliberate but faithful paraphrase if there were an idiom someone wasn't going to understand, or if they had to summarize. But this wouldn't even have to be that. The two sayings are the same length. So there's nothing heavy about this, and the reportage model can quite easily accommodate this as natural variation. Dr. Licona's theory instead is that Matthew was very deliberately changing Mark on this, and he theorizes perhaps this may have been to make it seem more personal to the audience, as if the voice from heaven, when it said, "You are my beloved son," it's not really personal enough. We want them to feel like this is personally spoken more to them, so we'll change this to, "This is my beloved son." I would say that's an overly complicated hypothesis. We don't really need that. Matthew can just be reporting a natural paraphrase, or even just looking away from Mark and just writing, "This is," because they probably wouldn't have been poring over both scrolls at the very same moment. And so that's a kind of an unnecessary theorizing. Oddly enough, Dr. Licona has said in his recent video that I am inconsistent for allowing that Matthew may have a trivial verbal variation here because I don't allow for these other things that I call fact-changing literary devices. He doesn't really say why that's inconsistent, and I don't see it as inconsistent, and I would challenge you as a viewer to think about that and see that, because I have right from the beginning talked about how the reportage model can accommodate this kind of natural variation. It's not legitimate to try to press a false dilemma. We talked about this false dilemma on Paraphrase in an earlier video, where you say, well, either you say they got it absolutely verbatim, or you allow for all these other changes. And then when somebody says, no, that's a false dilemma, I don't adopt that, to say, hey, you're not allowed to get out of that false dilemma. No nuance allowed. And that, I'm afraid, would be black and white thinking, but it's not my black and white thinking. Now, there are a few places in the Gospels where conservative scholars find it difficult to know how to resolve an apparent discrepancy. That happens. There are a few what I would call recalcitrant apparent discrepancies where we don't know for sure how to resolve them, and ordinary harmonizations don't seem to be working very well. One of these concerns a centurion, and the story of the centurion is found only in Matthew and Luke. And in the Gospel of Luke, it says that the centurion sent messengers to ask Jesus if he would heal his servant. And then later he sends messengers again to say, don't trouble the master. I am not worthy that you should come under my roof, but just speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed, and so forth. And Jesus is astonished at his faith. You probably remember that story from the Gospel of Luke. In Matthew, which is the only other gospel that tells it, it really does appear that the centurion is there personally. Matthew says he came and asks Jesus to heal his servant. And then a little bit later, when Jesus says, "Go, be it unto you accordingly as you have believed," Jesus uses a singular go because Greek is an inflected language. So he seems to be speaking to one person instead of to a group. So it's a little bit difficult to know how these can be put together. We should remember that probably the Gospel of Matthew was written first, and we can bear that in mind. That's the position I would take. I happen to agree there with a majority of scholars that Luke had not been written, and according to the way that Matthew narrates, you might get the impression Matthew himself had not yet been called. We also have additional information here, as in the case of the baptism. Matthew narrates a little extra thing that Jesus says. He says, "Many shall come from the east and from the west and sit down at the table with Abraham while the children of the kingdom are cast into outer darkness." That additional saying about the Gentiles and the faith of the centurion is found only in Matthew. So this, again, is evidence that Matthew has an independent source of information here. From my survey of evangelical scholars and just informally talking to people, I would say probably the most common resolution of this apparent discrepancy is that Matthew just sort of accidentally narrated in a way that made it appear that the centurion came in person. So, for example, if I said I'm building a house out in the suburbs, obviously you don't think I'm there personally, wielding the hammer and the nail. I'm hiring a contractor. Dr. Licona refers to this as the metonymy view. You can call it that if you want, that he is narrating it and saying the centurion said this, but he doesn't really mean to indicate, and he just accidentally gives the impression that the centurion was there personally. But there are a few problems, as I already mentioned, with that view, such as that he says that the centurion came, and then that singular verb later on doesn't seem to fit with the metonymy view. Dr. Licona's suggestion is what I would call a fact-changing literary device. Now, because he doesn't want to call things fact-changing unless they're what he considers big facts, he wouldn't call it that, but here's in what sense it is a fact-changing literary device. The theory there is that Matthew knew. He knew the version that we find in Luke. He knew that the servants came, but he deliberately erased the servants and deliberately wrote as if the centurion came to Jesus personally on purpose, even though he knew that was contrary to fact. Now, you can see why I call that a fact-changing literary device. And this might seem like a kind of a small matter, but it's a bigger matter than you might think. On a number of occasions, including at the Evangelical Theological Society last November, Dr. Licona has referred to this change that Matthew did as the kind of thing that we all do in ordinary conversation. Really? Is this the kind of thing that we all do in ordinary conversation? Let's think of an imaginary example to see if it is. So suppose that you had a friend and he came back from a conference and he said, "I met Lydia McGrew at this conference." Lydia McGrew came to the conference and she told me, he says to you, that she appreciated my encouragement in her work. So you go your way and later you discover that I was not at that conference. So you go back to your friend and you say, "Lydia wasn't at that conference. Now, she was at another conference that I know you went to. Did you maybe get them mixed up? Maybe you had that conversation with her at the other conference." And he cheerfully replies, "Oh, no. I knew she wasn't at the conference I told you about. In fact, I had a conversation with her husband instead, with Tim McGrew. And he passed on to me that she appreciates my encouragement in her work." So I erased him and I made Lydia come to the conference and I narrated it as if she came to the conference. And you say, but you said she came. Well, yeah, that's the kind of thing we all do all the time in ordinary conversation, right? No, you'd say it's not. I was definitely confused. Okay, so that kind of shows us that it's a bigger deal than we might otherwise think, even though it's not a big deal to the facts of the story. It would change our view of Matthew, just as it would change your view of your friend. I mean, from then on, when your friend tells you he's had a conversation with somebody, especially at a conference, you would probably say, I wonder if that really happened, because I know he considers it to be this thing we always do in ordinary conversation to change whether people were there. So I think in this case, we have to think more carefully. If we were just looking at Matthew and Luke as not scripture, suppose we were just looking at them as historical documents, what would be the first thing that would spring to mind? Well, it would be the same thing that would spring to your mind with your friend, that Matthew made a good faith error. In fact, we can even imagine him talking to someone who was there, who did narrate in that sort of metonymy way, and said that the centurion told him, or the centurion says to him, I'm not worthy, and so forth. And then maybe even narrated it with the plural verb, go to the servants, be it as you have believed. And then Matthew made a good faith paraphrase there, because he took it in good faith that the centurion was really personally there. And we can imagine how that easily could have happened. In his work, Dr. Licona has emphasized that as an historian, he's not allowed to assume a theological assumption such as inerrancy. That as a historian, he has to be open to a wider array of views than one might be theologically. So at least as a historian, he ought to be open to this view. Whereas the idea that Matthew deliberately changed it, that's an unnecessary view. And I would say it's rather uncharitable to Matthew. And it's also rather overly complex, and it's not something that we have sufficient evidence for. Now, if you do adopt a strong view of inerrancy, you can revert to that metonymy view and try to deal with the difficulties, or you can adopt a different type of harmonization where the centurion changes his mind and he comes later, and Jesus sees him in the crowd. Of course, Jesus is omniscient and he knows who he is and speaks to him. That's not my own view, but I think it's one to put out there for consideration. The point is that we do need to think about these details and not just dismiss it and say, oh, it's no big deal if Matthew made the centurion come when he knew he wasn't there. It's a bigger deal than you might think. Now, those of us who think of the Gospels as robustly reliable can discuss these, but I believe that all of us who have other reason to think of the Gospels as robustly reliable would prefer to think again about the centurion example rather than to adopt this literary device view according to which the gospel authors just felt free to make people be present when they weren't really present and so forth, which would have a larger impact upon reliability if we were consistent with it. And I think we would be right to prefer that. The reportage model does cost some time and effort and imagination, but I think that's actually how we have nuance. And there has to be times when we're willing to say, I just don't know. And that's not being spooky. That's not, woo, I'm punting to mystery and religion. No, that's what scientists do too. And it's certainly what historians do. Responsible scientists and historians have times when they say, I don't really know what's going on here or how to put these two things together. Maybe we'll get more information later. And that's what responsible interpreters have to do. And especially I've noticed that old-fashioned inerrantists are often willing to do that. But that should never stop us from accepting the strong evidence that we have for the reportage model and recognizing that the reportage model actually wins out evidentially very strongly over the literary device model. Come back next time when we'll be wrapping this up, this whole series, with a further discussion of what's at stake in this debate. And please do click on the blog post below if you want additional information about how I approach gospel differences, and also get a hold of a copy of The Mirror or the Mask. Thanks for watching.